number 3 of 6 of our smart pricing series, where today we're going to look at using smart matrix pricing by supplier and the configuration elements that are associated with that particular option. As you might expect, we're going to spend the majority of our time today over in the configuration module. When I open up the configuration module, I want to revisit for just a moment some of the content that we discussed in the webinar a little bit earlier, the second in our series, where we talked about underneath the parts menu, the set pricing method window. In this window here, this is where we'll define which pricing rules which pricing method we're going to use. And again, we talked a bit in that previous webinar about cost plus multiplier versus matrix pricing versus a smart matrix. And depending on what version of our writer you're on, we used to call smart matrix linear pricing. So if you see linear pricing, linear and smart matrix are essentially equivalent. We changed the name along the way. But again, as we talk about the different ways that we're going through, cost plus multiplier, matrix versus a smart matrix, our focus in the webinar today is going to be on using a smart matrix inside of the system. Then if you'll notice, underneath both my inventory and my outside purchases, I have smart matrix pricing by supplier selected as my methodology that we're going to use. Later today, we're going to do another webinar. Number 4, we'll be using smart matrix pricing by department. And then as we get a little bit later down the road, we'll come back and we'll do another one, smart matrix pricing by what we call associated labor. So we'll touch on each of these different options that are available as we go along. However, today's purpose, or at least the purpose of this webinar, we'll talk about using smart matrix pricing by supplier. I'm going to click on OK. And I'm going to close back out of there, and underneath configuration, if we go down to the parts menu, again, we were just in the set pricing method window where I have selected for both my inventory and my outside purchases, smart matrix pricing by supplier as my pricing methodology. So underneath my set pricing method option, there's a menu option for my inventory pricing. There's a menu option for my outside purchase pricing. We're going to start with outside purchases and work our way back to inventory as we finish up the webinar this morning. So in my default outside purchase pricing, when I bring up this window here, again, it's my smart matrix pricing wizard. And if you've never configured anything at all, again, you will still have a default outside purchase matrix. Again, we start with 1 by default. Now, all of these values down here may be zeroed out. However, again, there will always be at least the default. Again, so we can just, if we only wanted to have 1 pricing rule, we can modify the default. And as we look at this window, again, this is my default outside purchase matrix. Down here where it says settings, when it comes to setting up a smart pricing matrix, all we really need to do is say, okay, what's a common price point for the types of parts that this matrix will address? And then determine, well, what am I going to sell those for? So for example, everything from $0 to $1. The smart matrix has on the lower end a range, everything from $0 to $1. And I'll throw the caveat in there that this is not a recommended pricing structure. This is just what I'm using for demonstration purposes. But from $0 to $1, I'm going to mark those up 5 times. So a part that I buy for $1, I'm going to sell for 5. When I buy a part for $5, what am I going to sell that for? Meaning, am I going to sell it for $15? Am I going to sell it for $25? Am I going to sell it for $20? So all I really have to do is decide, well, when I buy a part for X amount, what am I going to sell it for? So in this case, my cost point number 1 is $5. And down beneath, you'll see CPM, margin, and markup. CPM stands for cost plus multiplier. And these are all variations on the same equation. What I mean by that is, if I mark something up 4 times, so I buy a part for $25, I mark it up 4 times, I sell it for $100. That means I'm going to achieve a 75% margin. And oh, by the way, if I mark something up or if I multiply it by 4, that's a 300% markup. So we have all 3 different variations. You don't have to change them all. What I mean by that is, if I said, well, let's see, for a part that costs me $5, I'd like to achieve a 73% margin. If I came in here and I just said, well, let's make that a 73% margin, as soon as I do that, it says, okay, based upon that value, let me redo the other math. Well, that means that a 73% margin would require a 3.7 times cost plus multiplier, or a 270% markup. Maybe I want a 4.2 times cost plus multiplier. It says, well, if you do that, then you're going to achieve a 76.19% margin or a 320% markup. So again, change whichever value you're comfortable with or you think in terms of, and the companion values change immediately along with it. So again, when I start out the conversation, it's really just, if you're going to buy a part for $20, what are you going to sell it for? If you're going to buy a part for $50, what are you going to sell it for? And so on and so forth. You can modify these cost points, and we will as we get into some other part types. However, again, as we go through with what we call our default, this one should apply to the majority of parts. We're going to set one up specifically for our batteries. We're going to set one up specifically for our tires, maybe for our dealer parts as we go through. But again, this will be if I don't build a specific matrix to address this subset of my parts that I'm buying, then this will apply because this is my default. So again, we just established cost points when I buy it for this, mark it up here, or I want to achieve this margin. You'll notice down at the bottom, underneath each, there's an option there for minimum price. When you're using a traditional matrix like this, where again, you've got 1, 5, 20, 50, the minimum really matters only on the low end. And what I mean by that is, if I said, well, let's see, anything from $0 to $1, we're going to mark up 5 times. So if I buy a part for $1, we're going to mark it up 5 times, sell it for $5. What if I buy a part for 25 cents? Well, I'm going to mark that up 5 times and sell it for $1.25. What if I bought a part for 10 cents? I'm going to mark it up 5 times and to sell it for 50 cents. Well, if I said, you know what, I want the minimum price to be $2.99, then it's going to do the math. If I buy that part that costs $1, I'm going to mark it up 5 times, sell it for $5. If I buy that part that costs 25 cents, it's going to mark it up for 5 times and come up to $1.25. And then it'll say, well, I am below the minimum price. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that up to $2.99 as the minimum price. So as we're looking here again, when I say that the minimums really only apply on the low end when we're using a traditional kind of pricing or smart matrix, that's because you figure for parts that cost from $1 to $5. At $1, it's going to get marked up 5 times. It's going to sell it for $5. At $1.01, marked up 5 times, it'll sell it for $5.05. $1.10, marked up 5 times. So the minimum really is $5 for anything in this range here. Here, and again, I'm going to make my math easier and go back to just a 4 times cost plus multiplier. Again, 5 times 4 works out to be 20. So again, the minimum in this case is going to be $20. So again, $5 becomes a $20 minimum. So again, when I talked about this being somewhat irrelevant, you could certainly say, well, I want it to be $22.99 as a minimum, and then that would override my straight calculation. But when I go ahead and I do the math, then I want to go ahead and I'm going to have my minimum just be exactly what this works out to be. I apologize for that just a second. I dropped for just a moment, so I apologize. Coming back in here as we talk about the minimums again, most applicable here, certainly you could use it in here, but again, we'll talk about a different example a bit later on that might be a more relevant piece where the minimums might come into play. As we continue talking about this window, down to the lower left-hand corner, where it says Global Parts Rounding Options, you'll notice in parentheses it says Applies to all matrices. And if I told the system I want to round up to, you'll notice there is no round down, there's no rounding, or there is round up to. And in your options there, you've got round up to 0. So if I just want to round the hundreds place, I want everything to end in a 0. So again, it might be 40 cents, 50 cents, 60 cents, 45, 55, 65, 49, 59, 69, or everything would be 12.50, 13.50, 14.50, 12.99, 13.99, 14.99. We have one opportunity to define a rounding rule. And when I define that rounding rule, it will apply not only to any outside purchase matrices I create, but also to any inventory matrices I create. So again, I don't have the ability to round some and not the other. It's going to either round or it's not going to round. I'm an advocate of rounding up to. I said we don't round down. And again, traditional rounding rules say up from 5, down from 4. So in theory, $12.49 would round down to $12, $12.50 would round up to 13. We don't follow those traditional rounding rules. We only round up. If I tell it to round up to 99 cents and it does the math and it decides that, well, that part should be $12.01, it won't go back to $11.99. It says I'm going to go forward to $12.99. Again, if it comes up and it should be $12.98, it's going to go forward to $12.99. It will never go backwards. It will always round up. Again, if you think about it, when you do the math, rounding in that manner means an average of 49.5 cents per part. So if you think about how many parts do I actually buy that the matrix would apply to on any given day, and basically to make the math easy, we'll say 50 cents a part. What's that number? Is it 20? Is it 40? Is it 60? Let's just go with 20. That means about $10 extra a day that rounding brings to the table. 60 bucks a week, 240 bucks a month, $3,000 at the end of the year, essentially is what it means if we're adding that rounding parameter. Again, if you haven't figured it out by now, I'm a fan of rounding. Some folks are afraid of what I call the Walmart effect. When you go into Walmart, everything is 97 cents. And that's because in your mind, when you see $12.97, you think, well, that's $12.97. You don't think, hey, that's $13. When you see $12.99, your mind intuitively says, oh, well, that's $13, and it rounds up. So again, if you're not a fan of that, well, then okay, it's your discretion, your decision. But again, it does become real money relatively quickly as we go along and add that rounding parameter. I'll get off my soapbox now and get back to talking about the actual functionality inherent therein. But again, you'll notice applies to all matrices. The exception is our smart labor matrix. And again, when we get into webinar number 6 of this 6-part series, we'll talk about using a smart labor matrix. And again, we can define a different rounding parameter there than what we have. But again, when it says it applies to all matrices, any matrices that apply to parts, whether it's inventory or outside purchase, will have this same rounding rule applied. Down here, there's a WhatIf box. And what I mean by that is, well, let's see. Right now, if I had my matrix set and I bought a part for $15, what am I going to sell that for? And I'll just put 15 as my sample cost, hit calculate, and it says, well, based upon the rules, it's 66.67% in progression, meaning it's 2/3 of the way from here to here. So 2/3 of the way from here to here would be 3.33 times, which works out to be a 69.97% margin or a 233% markup. Means we'd sell it for $49.95, but because I'm rounding to 99 cents, gonna round it up and make it $49.99. No minimum price taking effect there. So again, this calculate box is just there for us to go ahead and do a kind of what if calculator as we go along. Beneath that, minimum profit margin and then default cost plus multiplier for manual price calc. What those do is if I came in here and I wanted to add a part onto a ticket. So I'm just going to open up an estimate or a work in progress ticket. I'm just adding a part onto a transaction. And again, the part doesn't even matter whether it's in our inventory or not. But we give it a cost and we'll say that it's a $10 part, which by my rules rounds up to $36.99. If I was to use the price calc button, and again, this button exists on Gen 1 or Gen 2, when you click on price calc, again, what you notice is I've got my smart pricing assigned, $10 cost, 3.7 is my cost plus multiplier. However, my minimum margin is 50%. So again, that's where that value comes from, is over back into my smart pricing window. Again, default cost plus multiplier for manual price calc 2.5 times. What that'll do is that'll allow us as we're going through and using the calc prices button to go ahead and apply that 2.5 times as our default multiplier as we go along. Continuing on, there are 2 other tabs. There's my sales analysis tab and there's my suppliers tab. I'm going to skip this one for just a moment because, again, this is my default. I don't have any other matrices currently selected. So therefore, if I looked at my suppliers window, they are all included. You will notice that I have no ability to remove them. That's because I don't have another matrix to assign them to. With the default, you don't remove anything from the default. You would just be able to add if they weren't already assigned. But because I just have the one, everybody is assigned. We'll come back to this tab as we create a new matrix here in just a moment. Back to the sales analysis tab. I skipped this just momentarily because we often get the question of, well, I've never set this up before. How should I configure it? And the unfortunate reality is, well, that answer is different from shop to shop to shop, depending on your demographic, your mix of business, the types of services that you're offering. Again, so not really something that would be an area of expertise or something that I'd feel comfortable telling you where you want to set your matrix. However, one of the best barometers is the history that exists in your own system. Notice by default, this looks at the last year. If I wanted to go back 3 years, 6 years, 10 years, I certainly can. But when I go ahead and click on Run Analysis, it says, well, all right, now I've looked at your history, and based upon your historical data, here's what I can tell you. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to look at one of the ones here in the center. For parts that cost me between $20.01 and $50, I had sales last year of $54,584 against a cost of $22,623. So again, it went through all of the invoices for the last year. It said, let's find all the parts that cost me between 20 and 50 bucks and figure out what was my total cost and then what was my total sell. So that means we achieved a 58.55% margin in that range. That represented 34.67% of our total costs. So if you added all of these up and you did it as a percentage, this would come up to just under 35% of my costs. So obviously, comparatively, a fairly major category. My average cost was $31.62, and based upon my current matrix, with an average cost of $31.62, 64.41% would be the applied margin. So in theory, based upon where my settings currently are, I should achieve about a 64.5% margin on parts that cost me between $20 and $50. Again, year over year, obviously transactional sales different from one year to the other. However, again, it's just giving me an approximate. Had we used this on all of these in the last year, we would have been at a 64.41% margin. You know, as I'm looking at it, well, let's see. We were at 66%, we're going to go to 71. We were at 59%, we're going to go to 78. On the lower end, I always tell you to take these numbers with a grain of salt, at least to a certain degree. In a lot of cases, you might have parts that you're selling with either zero cost or an expense item that we put a cost of a penny into the system. So that margin can sometimes look inflated. That $1 to $5 will often include oil and oil filters. And again, those typically not sold necessarily at the same margin that, you know, a non-commodity, something like a fuel filter, cabin air filter, air filter might be sold for. So again, on the lower end, but certainly here, from 66 to 71, from 58 to 64, from 52 to 57. If I say, well, you know what, that looks a little bit more aggressive than I'd like to be. Let's come back in here and let's tweak these a little bit. Let's do 3.7 times. Let's only do 4.5 times on the low side. Let's do 2.8 and then 2.4. So again, all I'm doing is I'm just tweaking where these come into play. My $15 part now sells for $46.99, so $3 less than where it was before. However, if I now go back to my sales analysis and run it again, you'll notice that, okay, well, now we're going to be at from 58 to 62, from 66 to 69. So much smaller incremental increase based upon how I've tweaked those values. Down in the lower right-hand corner where it says aggregate profit margin, essentially what that says is, you know, if I use the rules at current, again, that would be the likely or based upon last year's sales, that would have been the margin had I applied my matrix religiously to every transaction. So again, looking for a 65% margin, this implies that that's where I would be. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to leave this where it sits for the time being. If I need to come back and tweak it down the road, certainly I can do that as often as I see fit. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit Save Changes in the upper right-hand corner. None of this matters as we're playing around with it until I hit Save Changes. Also, if I was to switch from one matrix to another, unless I've saved my changes, whatever changes I've made are lost to time. So I'd have to come back in and make those again. So again, we've got our default outside purchase, which, okay, great. That works out relatively well. As I look at my settings, however, again, probably not applicable for every product that I sell. Meaning, well, you know what, when I buy a battery, I've got a battery supplier, I typically get them from Interstate, and I'd like to mark those up differently. Or when I buy a set of tires, again, so we have the ability to define different matrices. I'm going to start out by hitting new in the upper right-hand corner, and I'm just going to call it battery outside purchase. Just so that anytime I come back in here to look at this matrix, I'll know exactly what this was intended to do. And so as I look at my batteries, well, you know what? I don't ever sell a battery that costs me less than 30 bucks. Again, so that's really the low point of my delta. So as opposed to doing 0 to 1, 1 to 5, 5 to 20, 20 to 50, I'm just going to start on the bottom and say everything from 0 to 30, I'm going to mark up 2.5 times. Now, again, that may be unrealistic for batteries, but that's where we'll start our markup. I apologize. Let's put that in the actual place where that belongs. Now, I could also say, you know what? Anything from 0 to 30, we're just going to sell for $49.99. And anything from 30 to 50, we're going to sell for $69.99. So I could use the minimum pricings to essentially do what I call tiered pricing. From 50 to 70, those things are going to sell for $89.99. And then from 70 to 100, now we're at $119.99. And again, what I've done is essentially, instead of doing a minimum price, it's always going to look at and say, well, where's the minimum that I need to be at? You know, to 130, those are going to be $149.99. And then from 130 to 175, those are going to be $199.99. And then from 175 to 250, those are going to be $299.99. And now, not likely that I'm ever going to sell a battery that costs me $250 or more, although I guess I shouldn't make that statement. Certainly if I'm doing hybrid batteries, these numbers would look completely different. But just our standard batteries, we could say anything 250 and above, we're just going to mark those up 1.5 times. Now, what we run into here is, well, at 175, it's 0, but the minimum is $299. Again, so a $250 battery would be $375. You know, so again, that really becomes my minimum for anything 250 and above. What I could have done all the way along is done a 1.5 times cost plus multiplier with a minimum price as well. So a $50 battery, if I did that, would actually be $75. But again, because the minimum comes up to $89.99. A $60 battery at 1.5 would be 90 bucks. So it would be actually exceeding the minimum. So again, I could actually use both in conjunction with one another. Oops. So again, now I've got essentially a flat line where we're using a cost plus multiplier of 1.5, however, having minimum prices assigned to make sure that we hit a particular delta as we go through. So again, I've created a battery outside purchase. What I now need to do is tell it, well, which suppliers does this apply to? In my case, I've got a generic supplier called my battery supplier. And again, you'll notice now that I've got a second matrix, I can now add suppliers to this matrix. All right, let's do that one more time. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a new matrix. And in this case, it's going to be tires. And I'm going to abbreviate just OSP for outside purchase and then say OK. Now, in this case, I just want a flat margin for tires. I'm going to do a 30% margin as my starting price or my price for tires. So if I said, you know what, I don't necessarily need to go through and configure everything. Let's just make anything that costs from $0 to $10,000. Odds that I'm ever going to sell a tire that cost me more than 10 grand are not great, and I'll probably pay extra attention to where we're marking that thing up if I ever did. So in this case, I said a 30% margin, which works out to be a 1.43 times cost plus multiplier, and realistically, everything from here forward somewhat irrelevant, because it's just going to now say as long as the cost is less than 10 grand, we're going to make that a 30% margin or a 1.43 times cost plus multiplier. I'll hit save changes. You can continue on in that manner for as long as you'd like. And again, I apologize. Before I did that, I probably should have gone in and said, well, let's see. I've got a couple of different tire suppliers. We'll say American Tire and Carroll Tire, as well as Goodyear belongs in that list. So we scroll down a little bit. Looks like those are we got a generic tire supplier as well. So again, adding all of my tire suppliers in, and then now from this point forward, they would use this as their pricing matrix as we go through. Again, anytime I make a change, I want to hit save changes. One last note, when you hit the sales analysis button, and if I clicked on run analysis again, what you're going to notice is that it's done the analysis again, but the numbers are significantly smaller. Whenever you run the analysis, it says, well, I'm only looking at the parts that fall into this matrix. So unless it came from, in the last year, these suppliers, they aren't included in my calculation. So the analysis actually gets more focused as we create more matrices, because the more that I've got, the more it will focus in on exactly the parts that I'm talking about for a particular matrix. But I'm going to close back out of this window here because I'm going to go back. As we started out the conversation, I said there were two different ways to configure it, one for inventory, one for outside purchases. I'll ask you before I close this window to just take a quick glance at this lower left-hand corner where you see just a big empty space. And that's because the only difference between the two windows is if I came in here where it says default inventory pricing, is these three buttons in the lower left-hand corner. Everything else behaves exactly the same. There is no difference in the functionality, except I can change all of my default pricing matrices for my inventory parts, hit save changes, and it doesn't actually apply that pricing to my master inventory. The way that I apply that to my master inventory is I click save and update inventory pricing. So again, if I had 8 different matrices and I came in and I changed one of them, I want to hit save and inventory pricing because now it's going to go through and recalculate all of my pricing based upon the changes that I've now made. So again, save and update inventory pricing. That's the primary difference. The other piece, disable smart pricing and enable smart pricing for inventory parts under this matrix. I'm going to jump back into just my main arrow writer window. I'm going to go ahead and get into the inventory record for a part. In this case, it's an oil filter. To the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice there's a checkbox there that says no smart pricing. If I said, well, let's see, I'd like to check that box for an entire series of parts as opposed to having to go through them one at a time, then what I could do is I could create a matrix. And its only purpose was to allow me to click this button that says disable smart pricing. And it'll go through each one of those records and check that box. Underneath that, there's one that says enable smart pricing. Had I ever gone through and turned off or checked all those boxes, then the enable would allow me to essentially undo it. So click on enable, and now it goes through and it unchecks that box on any parts. So again, there's your difference between the default inventory and default outside purchase.